Welcome to today's webinar from the International Alliance of ALS-MND Associations, where we will share with you some of the findings from a recent global survey on the fundamental rights for people living with ALS-MND and caregivers. For this webinar, we have English and Spanish captions available. If you're joining us live on Zoom, please check the chat box as we are adding the instructions right now. And if you're watching the recording in our YouTube channel, you will find the instructions in the video description on how to activate the subtitles. Para este seminario web tenemos disponibles subtítulos en inglés y español. Si te estás uniendo en vivo a través de Zoom, por favor verifica el cuadro de chat, ya que estamos añadiendo las instrucciones en este momento. Y si estás viendo la grabación en nuestro canal de YouTube, encontrarás las instrucciones en la descripción del video sobre cómo activar los subtítulos. Thank you to our sponsors Amylyx, Biogen, and Sobi, without whom this webinar series would not be possible. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jessica Maid, Programs Coordinator for the International Alliance of ALS-MND Association, and presenting with me today is Kathy Cummings, Executive Director of the Alliance. Now, some final instructions. Any questions you have for us, please write them in the Zoom Q&A box. If you're watching from Facebook, you can add your questions in the comments. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who pre-submitted their questions. There is a lot to cover today, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time we have. Before we dive into the survey results, we want to provide you with some background on the fundamental rights on which the survey was based. The first version of the fundamental rights was conceived in the 1990s, and they are reviewed and updated annually by our PALS and CALS Advisory Council, and we refer to them as the PCAC. The PCAC is charged with helping the Board of Directors of the International Alliance consider and include in its work the wide-ranging opinions and ideas of people with ALS-MND and caregivers to people with this diagnosis across the globe. In February 2021, an independent document on the fundamental rights for caregivers is created, as their needs and rights differed from those with living with ALS and MND, but also of great importance. The fundamental rights were last revised in August of this year, 2023. The rights are aspirational in nature, with recognition that many countries will not be at the same level, but allowing those that have achieved those rights to enhance them and others to develop their efforts using a global baseline. Our aspirational statement is that these fundamental rights represent the ideal for individuals living with ALS, MND, and caregivers worldwide. These documents represent the set of rights all Alliance member organizations should adopt and promote as conditions, systems, and resources allow. Now, I will quickly walk you through the rights. People living with ALS-MND have the right to the highest quality treatments and care available. Previously, care was the first right in the document, but the order has been switched to emphasize the importance of access to treatment. They also have the right to information and education, to choice, to end-of-life choices, to provide input on the healthcare and support systems, to the liberty to live the best quality of life possible, and to live without discrimination. They also have the right to confidentiality and privacy, to receive any governmental or other economic remuneration benefits and entitlements, to have access upon diagnosis to genetics, counseling, genetic testing, education, and to be safeguarded against genetic discrimination. The caregiver rights have had some wording improved and rights have been added and expanding. The first right is new, the right to be treated by all with respect and regarded as experienced in managing the care of the person living with ALS-MND. Caregivers have the right to receive support in all areas, and that includes counseling, emotional support, time to take care of themselves, to be able to ask for a support person, to be able to plan for their own future, and to have access to palliative care and bereavement advice services. Right number 3 is to have access to all elements and mechanisms that will facilitate and help their efforts. And right number 4 is also new, to stay with the person with ALS-MND when admitted to medical facilities, as the caregiver knows the requirements and needs of that person. This is to avoid undue stress on that person and the caregiver. The caregiver must be allowed input on the management of the daily care on that person. Caregivers also have the right to provide input and to receive governmental and other economic remuneration. Over to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Jess. And I think it's fair to say that the rights that Jessica just went through, both for caregivers and people living with ALS, MND, drive everything we do at the Alliance. So this fundamental rights survey that we first launched in 2021 is very important to all the work that we do. And we were really pleased with the results that we received in 2021, but we had some objectives when we decided to redo the survey in 2023 to improve the survey design. You always want to tweak things and make them better as you go through various projects. And we wanted to achieve some meaningful results. So some of the things we did in the survey design, we were hoping would improve global participation, and we wanted to compare with the UN Convention on Disability Rights. And we wanted to achieve results that really told us a story, told us what was going on around the world. Were there differences if language came into play? Was there differences between the global North and global South, urban and rural, and so on? So we were very lucky. We reached out to a fantastic data analyst, Sarah Praventa, who works for the ALS Association, and she helped us develop an analysis plan ahead of the survey so that we knew what we wanted to get out of the survey results. And we're just going to talk a little bit about some of these changes in the design and the results and what we were expecting to learn. So Jess, if you could advance the slide, thanks. So in terms of our key demographics, we were really, really pleased with the survey results. We opened the survey on May 1st and we closed it on June 30th. So it was open for a full 60 days, which was a little bit longer than our 2021 survey. We received responses from 54 countries and we had a total of 1927. So we basically doubled what we received in 2021, and that was our goal, was to double the amount of responses we received, because it makes the data more statistically significant. And we heard from some different countries, individuals in different countries this time. So we had 47% of the respondents, 903 of them were people living with ALS, MND, and 54%, 884 of them were a current or former caregiver of a person living with ALS, MND. So at this point, the first thing I want to do is say a huge thank you to the survey respondents, to all the people living with ALS, MND and their caregivers. Thank you so much for completing the survey. This gives us very valuable data to be able to take forward at the global level. So, as I said, one of the things we did was compare against the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the optional protocol. So you don't have to read this slide. It was basically to show you that we did a big Excel spreadsheet that compared our rights to each of the articles. There were some that were very important to compare to our fundamental rights, like we wanted to compare against accessibility and choice and the things that appear in our rights. We wanted to make sure we had covered off everything in the UN articles. And the UN articles is really about the global promotion and protects all human rights and freedoms for people living with disabilities, including those with ALS, MND. So the next concept that we introduced in this particular survey, we didn't ask anything about it. We just tagged the countries where people were answering from in terms of whether they fit with the global North or the global South. And this concept really simplifies the complexities of global geopolitics and economic disparities. And the division between North and South really helps illustrate the global inequality that we have in the ALS M&D community. So the global north are countries that have mature economies. They're usually more wealthy. They're politically stable. That I think is a little bit of a subjective term right now in the world, but typically the global north is politically stable. Global south is more developing economies, usually faster population growth, and so on. So you can see how the countries are categorized on this particular slide. So now we're going to hear from a member of our PALS and CALS Advisory Council, Bruce Virgo, who's an Australian based now in Scotland, and he's going to talk about some of these concepts.
My name is Bruce Virgo. I'm Australian, but living in Scotland. I was diagnosed with MND ALS in 2014 in the UK, and this was later confirmed as PLS, a rarer form of our disease, only affecting the upper motor neurons. I have been a member of the Alliance's Patients and Carers Advisory Council since March 2020. The Council developed a Statement of Fundamental Rights, and our earlier survey revealed that these fundamental rights are not universally respected. We developed a wider ranging survey as we were interested to get an understanding of the difference between mature, wealthy, and politically stable economies and the rest of the world. We are using the global North and South breakdown obtained from the United Nations to assess this. I want to thank everyone from around the globe for participating and supporting our latest survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And even though Jessica and I had our pictures at the beginning as delivering this webinar, we actually have some vignettes from a number of people on our PALS and CALS Advisory Council. So you'll be seeing those throughout the webinar. So the next piece that we looked at in terms of the demographics was language and the impact of language on the survey results. We had more languages available for the survey this time. We had 16 languages, and you'll see that English was the second highest language that was the survey was completed in. And we feel very strongly at the Alliance that language does impact the fundamental rights and people's ability to access, whether it's treatments, care, education, information, and so on. And we're going to talk about that later. So we really, really appreciate our organizations, member organizations in various countries that translated the survey for us. And that way we were able to offer these surveys in 16 languages, so people could complete them in the language of their choice. So let's look at the results now. Now that we've looked at the survey design, what happened with the results? So again, similar to 2021, the overall median of the rights is at 52, which means the rights are not well respected. Obviously, they're at different levels, and we're going to talk about that at an individual level, but they're not well respected around the world. That's even more true for the rights of caregivers. The median is 36, so a lot lower than the rights of people living with ALS. And we'll talk about this again at the individual level for each of these rights. So let's take a look at the rights of people living with ALS, MND. The very first right, as Jessica said, we've made a change to make this one the first among equals of the fundamental rights, which is the highest quality treatments available. And what we did with each of these rights is we did drill down questions. We dove deeper into what does it mean to have the highest quality treatments available. So we interpreted that at the PALS and CALS Advisory Council that it means you have access to approved drugs and you have access to clinical trials. So we asked people the basic question, do you feel you have access to the highest quality treatments available, with no qualifiers? And people either agreed strongly, agreed, or disagreed strongly or disagreed. And then of course there's a neutral bar in the middle. And then what we did is we compared that to access to people who said, yes, they had access to approved drugs, and yes, they had access to clinical trials, to see if those two things influenced their agreement about the highest quality treatments available. And we did that for all of the questions. So I went into a little more detail on this one to explain how we compare sub questions to the main question so that the findings relate to those. So the word access is going to come up throughout this webinar. It is by far the biggest challenge that we face globally, is the inequality in access. And that is certainly true for treatments, the highest quality treatments available. I think it's almost a given that people understand this, but it is an urgent and unmet need in our community that there is not access to approved treatments in many parts of the world. It's definitely unbalanced between the global north and global south. And there is a strong relationship between access to clinical trials and access to the best possible treatment outcomes. So people were much more likely to agree that they had access to the highest quality treatments if they also had access to clinical trials. We know that clinical trials are not equitably distributed around the world. And so this is a very important finding for us. 81% of respondents reported that having access to riluzole, and only 20% had access to edaravone, and 11% to AMX 0035 in whatever name it is in their country. So one of the other things that we wanted to point out is that, as I said, clinical trials is a very important driver of access to the highest quality treatments. And you can see that only 10% of respondents were currently participating in a clinical trial. 13 had participated in the past, but we had a high percentage, 36%, that would be willing to participate in a clinical trial in the future if there was one available to them. And 32% said they had no access to clinical trials. Again, very important data for the Alliance. And of course, the Global North had a much higher participation rate than those in the Global South at 28% versus 12%. So what are the drivers of the highest quality treatment? The right number one. Top drivers are having, so again, this is through the data analysis. People were more likely to say they have agreed if they had access to AMX 0035, if they had access to edaravone, or they were currently participating in a clinical trial. The top three drivers of disagreement were not having access to riluzole, not having access to edaravone, and no access to clinical trials. So what's the Alliance doing about this? We want to talk about what this data is meaning to us. And the important things for the highest quality treatment available is that the Alliance has a number of projects that we're working on right now. We've been reaching out to existing and new networks in underrepresented communities around the world to enhance networks so that the entire globe is included. We're doing roundtables for our member associations. Our next roundtable for our member associations is about access to treatments and the development pathway. And our Advocacy and Public Policy Committee is very focused on this at a global level, and also how can we work with the local level to increase access to treatments. And of course, we always have ongoing conversations with our industry partners. So I spent quite a bit of time on that particular right. We will go through the care right also in a lot of detail, and then some of the other ones we'll go through a little bit faster. I see that there's a question in the chat. Will the slides be available? And the entire webinar will be available. We will post it probably in about 48 hours to our website, and everything will be available.
Thank you, Kathy. So now we're going to move into the second right, the highest quality care available. And I'm going to let Angelique from our Pals and Cows Advisory Council get us started.
Hello, everybody. My name is Angelique van der Rit. I'm 53 years old. And I live in the Netherlands, Europe. I'm a member of the PCAC. I would like to thank you to everyone for participating and supporting the survey. From the previous survey, we know that not everyone has access to multidisciplinary care. In the Netherlands, we are so very fortunate to have a system that makes it accessible to everyone. And how this is so important for the quality of life for the patients living with ALS and care management. I sincerely hope that multidisciplinary care becomes accessible to all and not limited to some countries. I wish you a very good day.
Thank you, Angelique. So this right means not only to have access, but also to have ease of access to a multidisciplinary clinic. To receive care from a multidisciplinary team specialized in ALM, SM&D, and to receive support in all areas related to this diagnosis, for example, therapies, home adaptations, communication, and emotional support programs, to just mention a few. This right also means to have access to an ALS-MND association providing care supports. We had quite a few interesting findings. So 46% of people with ALS-MND have access to a multidisciplinary clinic. This is pretty much the same as what we found in the survey from 2021. For those with access to a multidisciplinary care center, approximately 1 in 30 find the center difficult to access, and the rate climbs to 49% for Global South countries. Also, here the word access comes in again, is access is highest amongst English-speaking respondents with 76%, and in the Global North, 53%. We also found that genetic counselors are considered the most specialized in ALS-MND. And 60% of people with ALS-MND consider neurologists to be highly specialized, and highly specialized neurologists were mostly highly reported by English-speaking respondents, again with 75%, and lowest among non-English respondents. Access to healthcare specialists is highly connected to strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing with whether or not a person living with ALS feels they're receiving high-quality care. Just as in 2021, the top 3 professionals providing care were a neurologist with 76%, physiotherapists 57%, and respiratory therapists with 45%. Also, global North countries have much higher access to nurses, social workers, and neurologists and occupational therapists. And there are clearly some large gaps between global North and global South and English and non-English respondents. And this we found a lot throughout a lot of the data was the difference between English and non-English respondents. In this figure, you can see that the most frequently supported item is medication, but that was only reported by 56% of people with ALS-MND. The proportion of respondents reporting that they receive support with medication has decreased from the 2021 survey, which reported 62%. We also found that the largest gap in total supported areas in between English-speaking respondents and non-English respondents. And you can also see very, very low numbers in essential areas of different types of support. Only 16% responded to have emotional support programs, and 13% to palliative care and bereavement advice and services, and 10% to receive support to family counseling, and only 8% to hospice care. We were particularly seeing the lower numbers in this graph, we found particularly shocking the very low amount of support in this in emotional programs and family counseling and hospice care. The Alliance is focusing on how to improve access to care in underrepresented areas. One of the projects that will help achieve this is the Global ALS-MND Clinic Locator, which we're aiming to launch later this year. This locator will help you find your closest ALS-MND clinic. We're also working with genetic counselor groups in order to make genetic counseling available globally. We also did an analysis of the drivers of high quality care, and we found that respondents who strongly agreed were represented in higher proportions in the categories of being able to receive care from an occupational therapist, speech therapist, genetic counselor, and also to receive support for voice banking at or near diagnosis. And that respondents who strongly disagreed with high quality care did not have access to a multidisciplinary clinic. Now let's move to the right to information and education that will enable PALs to have active roles in their decision making. So this means that they should have access to adequate resources in the language of their choice and in accessible format. Globally, in total, almost 2/3 agreed that they have access to information and education. And this right is better respected in countries where English is spoken. The highest proportion of those who agreed were among English speakers with 87% and among rural respondents with 73%. At the Alliance, we have a health literacy project where we are identifying gaps in information and resources available with the goal of developing and or expanding in areas where there is lacking of information. We also have a webinar series open to the entire community, and we will also be increasing dissemination of global events from our member associations. We're looking to develop resources in multiple language and deliver our conferences in a hybrid format and offer translation of webinars and conferences. Kathy?
Thanks, Jess. The next right that we're going to look at is the choice with respect to who helps you. Who are your health and support workers, and what does that mean to us at the Alliance? So it's quite interesting, the results from this. The ability to choose is directly linked to the quality of healthcare. This isn't surprising. People like to have autonomy in their choices of who they work with, where they take their treatments and their health support, and the type of treatment or support provided. So if you have autonomy to be able to choose, this is also a right that is firmly embedded in the UN Convention as well. And it does drive how people feel about their health care. And again, very similar, you're going to hear this throughout the webinar, the highest level of agreement is among English speakers and the global north. Excuse me. So what's the Alliance doing about this, about the respect of the right to choose? Again, roundtables and webinars, working with our Advocacy and Public Policy Committee and sharing best practices among our member organizations. We also are deliberately including volunteers from diverse backgrounds and diverse areas in the world in our advisory groups, so that we're hearing about the impacts globally, and we're developing more content that supports allied health professionals. We've always had our allied health professional forum at our conference at the end of the year, but we're developing more resources. For example, we developed a program last year called Breaking the News, which was a communications protocol for delivering news throughout the ALS M&D journey, and it's to support healthcare professionals. So those are the types of things that we're doing around the right to have choice. The next right that we're going to look at is around end-of-life choices, which includes the right to accept, refuse, or discontinue treatment or intervention within the legal framework of your country. So it's important within that right that end-of-life decisions are not just focusing on ending life, but also what are your directives? What do you want? As our colleague Gudjin puts it, it's also about, living life to the fullest, if that's your choice. So we look at all angles of end-of-life choices. And in terms of the results that we received, the highest levels, again, are among of agreement are among English-speaking respondents, and advanced directives are not common practice in many countries. So again, education and developing resources is what the Alliance is doing about this particular right. I'm going to pause for a second because a question came across the chat about the previous right and what is the Alliance doing about disseminating Breaking the News program. We have it fully available on our website. Anyone can pick it up and use it. And we are working with an educational consultant to change it into a course module that can be embedded in any faculty of healthcare professionals that work with the ALS M&D community. So that includes, physical therapy, OTs, speech language, neurology, obviously, nursing, and so on. So any faculty will be able to pick that up and embed it as a 1 week course within any of their programs. So that should be available in 2024, but everything is fully available on our website in the format that it's being delivered right now.
Thanks, Kathy.
Okay.
No.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's right. So let's now talk about the right to provide input on the healthcare and support systems. This right means that people living with ALS M&D need to be better empowered as advocates. We found that overall, slightly over half agree with all 3 statements of this right about being able to provide input on policy and care choices. When it comes to being able to provide input, Global North countries and English speakers have the highest levels of agreement. And Also, with what the Alliance is doing is we deliver roundtables to help our member associations with their advocacy efforts. We also develop materials and toolkits, and we have an advocacy and public policy committee, which Kathy mentioned previously. The next right is the liberty to live the best quality of life possible. For PALS, this means to be happy, to be comfortable, to have or develop new hobbies and have access to assistive technology devices. Our findings show that 1 in 3 respondents have access to assistive technology communication. The majority of respondents are unaware of voice preservation, and that the proportions of those who are unaware are highest in the Global South with 65%, and the lowest among respondents from English-speaking countries, which is 23%. Those who are currently enjoying cultural activities have a significantly higher proportion in the higher quality of life column. And those who can no longer do activities like sports and be part in cultural activities have a significantly higher proportion in the lower quality of life column. We have found that participation in activities of arts, culture, sports definitely improve the quality of life of people living with ALS. The Alliance has a working group led by our PALS and CALS Advisory Council on arts, culture, and sports, and we are also starting a voice preservation project led by the Innovation and Technology Advisory Council. We're starting this pilot in Colombia, then we will be looking to move to Iceland as a country that has a complex language, and we're also looking to work with Africa to make this technology globally accessible. Kathy?
Thanks, Jess. We're going to focus on the right to live without discrimination, and I'm going to ask you to cue up the video for our friend Albert.
Hi, my name is Albert Khoo from Malaysia. I'm a person living with ALS. However, as a PALS, that has given me a more realistic look at things around and also the road ahead for PALS and CALS around the world. Being a member in PALS and CALS Advisory Council, we have had the opportunity to look at the rights and discrimination of PALS. The rights of this which we have studied together with the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities has laid down many of the international acceptable standards for us to deliver in this survey. As part of the committee that study these rights, I saw what are the pressing needs of these rights to be established to safeguard and protect against discrimination for persons living with ALS. In my country, or more so in the region from which I come from, many of the rights of the person living with ALS are considered negligible or none in existence because the disease received little or least attention among the medical circle. Buildings, car parks, or even structures which are meant for persons with disabilities can sometimes be regarded as not usable and badly constructed, and are good only for cosmetic purposes in some cases. The country also lacked enforcement of the laws where clear and obvious discrimination happens to persons living with disabilities when their rights are flouted. It is therefore important that this survey is foremost as one of the study that we intend to bring this to each of the member association country to first respect the laws that safeguard the interests and the person living with ALS. I would also like to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to everyone for the time to complete the survey and for supporting all our initiatives. This means a lot to all of us at ALS Alliance International.
Thank you, Albert, for those words. And discrimination is something that we have found through the survey that 1 in 3 people living with ALS have indicated that they have experienced discrimination, much higher in the global south, and that there is little awareness of the UN disability rights. The Alliance works on these promotion and protection of our fundamental rights and what we're doing about it. Jess, can you advance the slide? Is that we're working with our advocacy and public policy group, but also working with local advocacy groups using these survey results to try and improve accessibility, independence, and equal participation in daily living with no discrimination for people living with ALS MND. The next right that we're going to look at is confidentiality and privacy. This was the highest rated right on the last survey in 2021. It's still high, although we did find 36% of people were unsure of their confidentiality. The Alliance follows the GDPR rules because we're a UK registered charity. So in terms of us, we try and lead by example. And one of the things that would go against this right, I guess, a little bit, is that we would like to overcome the barriers of being able to share data across national borders so that we have bigger databases that people can mine for information about ALS, MND, and sometimes confidentiality and privacy laws are a barrier to that. So that's something we'll have to delve in a little bit more. The next right that we're going to look at is to receive any available governmental or other economic remuneration benefits and entitlements. Jess, I'm just going to check in with you. I think that you want to speak to this one specifically.
Yes. So this right is particularly important because employment circumstances can change and households tend to go in financial strain. Therefore, it is important to have fast systems in the provision of care and, if possible, to have supplemental insurance. The reality is that ALS MND put families in poverty. Some interesting findings were that only 23% of respondents have supplemental insurance, and respondents who did not do the survey in English and those from the Global South were less likely to have supplemental insurance. Over 4 in 5 persons with ALS MND have been affected economically, that's 81%, and 37% have had to leave employment completely. The largest gap in economic change was between non-English respondents, where 85% were affected, versus English at 71%, although both numbers are extremely high. The Alliance is advocating for global access, and this includes financially accessible. We are working with underrepresented geographies and communities. We're also amplifying local campaigns globally, and we're developing benchmarking materials on a case-by-case basis. We're also going to be working with this report of the survey with the countries that were statistically significant and sharing the data specific to them and how they compared against the rest of the world. Kathy?
Thanks, Jess. The next right that we're going to look at is around genetic counseling and testing. And this right was added to the fundamental rights in 2021 because we didn't have a specific right around genetic counseling and testing. And so access is unchanged since our 2021 survey, and only 6% report access to counseling, which is an appallingly low number, I don't mind saying. English speakers had better access to genetic education, and the Global South had very, very low reported numbers. We believe strongly at the Alliance that genetic counseling and testing have to go hand in hand, and that testing should not be done in isolation of counseling. So the fact that the testing numbers were higher, access to testing was higher than access to counseling, is a little bit disturbing to us. So what is it that we're working on with the right to access to genetic counseling and testing? We're developing resources and webinars. We have some very specific worksheets on what does it mean to have ALS, MND genetics. These are all available on our website, and we're working with providers of online genetic counseling and industry partner sponsored programs to try and increase access to genetic counseling and testing. Jess, would you mind advancing the slide? Thank you. Now we're going to switch gears completely. We have about 15 minutes left. I will remind you that you can put questions in the chat at any time. And we're going to switch gears and move over to caregivers now, which was a separate and independent survey of the questions that were asked of people living with ALS. And Jess is going to kick it off with a video for the caregiver section.
My name is Rocio Reyes. I'm from Colombia, and I have been a caregiver to my husband, a person with ALS-MND, for over 20 years. And I want to share with you the relevance of the caregiver for people with ALS, and therefore the importance of the fundamental rights of the caregiver. Caregivers are those who accompany, assist, and support a relative with ALS in their daily lives. We witness their difficulties, their needs, and their wishes. We attend them with love, understanding, and hope, but we also suffer, exhaust ourselves, and feel lonely. We are living with ALS even if we don't suffer from it. That is why it's essential that caregivers are heard, that they are given a voice, and that we receive emotional, social tools, and governmental benefits for a better care for both our relative and ourselves. We need to have all kinds of help to continue giving our love and unconditional support to our loved ones with ALS-MND. Thank you to all the caregivers who participate in the survey, and at the same time gave visibility to the rights of the caregiver. I hope this message serves to raise awareness among society and authorities about the situation of caregivers of people with ALS, and about the need to respect our rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rocio. It's a great way to start the next section of this webinar. So, an interesting finding before we go into the rights themselves. In the survey, we asked people living with ALS how many paid caregivers they had. Overall, persons with ALS-MND are most likely to have a single caregiver. And when it came to paid caregivers, 55% said they had none, and another 20% said they had a single paid caregiver. Now let's talk about the first caregiver right, the right to have support in all the areas that we have listed and mentioned before. This right means that caregivers have the right to receive support in all areas, to have time to take care of themselves and to seek help when needed, to plan for their own future and have access to palliative care and bereavement advice services. In the 2023 survey, a higher proportion of caregivers agreed rather than disagreed about receiving support via counseling, which reversed the trend we saw in the 2021 survey. Counseling and emotional support programs are the areas in which caregivers most often receive support, and only 36% of caregivers report being able to have time to take care of themselves, which was slightly up from 23% in 2021. This is still very low. Caregivers globally receive limited palliative care, bereavement advice, and services. And the proportion of caregivers receiving support increased from 28% in 2021 to 34% in 2023. As I said, still low. And only 1 in 3 caregivers agree about receiving social or respite support, up from 22% in 2021. Also, rates of support in the Global South were higher than in the Global North. At the Alliance, we review the caregiver rights every year, and that help with the global advocacy. Also, within our webinar series, we always try to bring in the caregiver's perspective and work towards offering resources in different languages to help them out.
So the first right that Jess talked about was the support of the caregiver themselves. And the second right is about information and education that the caregivers have access to for, training and being able to support the person with ALS. So not necessarily inward focused, but more outward focused in their ability to access what they need to be able to be a caregiver. So what did we find out about that particular right? Having access to the elements and mechanisms that facilitate decisions about care and support are very important. And there wasn't a lot of improvement in availability. Not surprisingly, the access to information is reported higher by English speakers. So again, we would emphasize our health literacy project that we're working on, our resources in multiple languages, similar to what we talked about in the rights for people living with ALS. We want to beef up our resources for caregivers around those information pieces that they need for training and resources to be able to support the person living with ALS, MND the best that they can. So the next right is to be able to provide input. So advocacy is very similar to the right in the persons living with ALS, MND, and it's important for caregivers to also be able to advocate both with health systems on behalf of the individual living with ALS, but also with governmental systems. And caregivers have provided so much valuable input to the International Alliance and to local agencies in their jurisdictions. So it's very important that people have the right to advocate. And so advocacy levels remain low for caregivers. That's the finding from this particular survey. You can see that 40% agreed that they could have input into the healthcare system, and only 36% into medical research and protocols. So very disappointingly low results in terms of caregiver input to advocacy in healthcare and medical research procedures. So the PCAC is the area that spends a lot of time on this. Every single meeting we talk about caregiver support and the input into medical research and procedures. And we are getting more involved in local patient advocacy groups, providing global support to them. So the next right for caregivers, again, is very similar. It goes hand in glove with the one for people living with ALS, which is, we know ALS, MND affects the economics of both the person living with ALS, but usually the caregiver as well. So I won't repeat what Jess said in terms of ALS being a disease that often causes poverty, but I think we all intrinsically know that the economic situation is impacted greatly for people living with ALS, MND. And so in terms of caregivers, 4 out of 5 caregivers reported having their economic situation changed by ALS MND, 78%. That is a huge number, and not surprising, but very, very difficult that so many people are impacted in their economic situation. 1 in 5 caregivers leave employment, and 1 in 5 caregivers make adaptations to their jobs. So that's a full 40% that their employment is impacted right out of the gate with ALS MND. So 4 out of 5, as we said earlier, their situation is affected. And of course, the global south is more economically affected than the global north. So this is a slide that we want to delve into a lot deeper and see what we can do to impact caregiving remuneration around the world. So what are the next steps? We're almost out of time. We only have 6 minutes left, but that's okay. This is our last slide. And as I said before, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. But what are our next steps for this survey? We have very rich data and we want to share and publish the survey results. Obviously, this webinar is our first step towards sharing the survey results. We will also be sharing the results of this survey at the PACTALS meeting in Kuala Lumpur next week. And we'll be sharing a poster at the ALS MND Research Symposium at the end of the year in Basel. We'll be sharing various parts of this survey in our Allied Professionals Forum and our Alliance meeting at the end of the year. And we'll dig deeper into the data. There are some very specific results that we want to delve into more. For example, Jessica highlighted the appallingly low number of people that received support for family, youth, and caregivers at 10%. We want to dig deeper into that with our member organizations that work with youth specifically. So we're going to look into areas with significant findings as well. And we will work with each country that reached a statistically significant level. We provide them with reports for comparing their country against the rest of the world and areas of opportunity for them to move those rights up within their jurisdictions. We'll also have some specialized reporting for projects. We did a whole series of questions around voice preservation and what technology is available to individuals. And we have a project that we're working on to increase voice preservation in underrepresented communities. We're doing pilots in Iceland and Colombia, and we're hoping to do one in South Africa as well, although we haven't moved forward on that front yet. But we will do specialized reporting on the data on voice preservation that we got from this survey. And we'll obviously be able to prioritize in terms of our own strategic planning where are the areas of greatest need in terms of the global landscape. We want to stick in our lane of looking at things with a global perspective and where we can supporting local perspective, but we will need to prioritize. There's a lot of data in here. We know there's a lot of inequality and a lot of access issues. We can't do it all, but with the limited resources that we have, but we would like to tackle as much as we can. And so the Alliance will need to prioritize in terms of next steps. So I want to say a big thank you at this point to our sponsors of the webinar series. Without your sponsorship, we couldn't deliver the sponsorships that we do. I want to say a huge thank you to Jessica, who is the driver of the Fundamental Rights Survey. She supports the PALS and CALS advisory group and makes a huge difference in the ALS MND community. So thank you, Jessica, for all that you do. And the biggest thank you I want to give is to our PALS and CALS Advisory Council. We have fantastic volunteers on our PALS and CALS Advisory Council. You saw 4 of them today in the videos, but there are 15 dedicated individuals who are consistently moving the work of the Alliance and the ALS MND community forward. And thank you from the bottom of my heart to the whole PALS and CALS Advisory Council. So without further ado, that's the end of our webinar. And thank you for the comment in the chat. And really, there's so much more that we could talk about with this data, but we will leave it at this, at this high level, and we'll continue to mine the data over the next couple of years and provide input into many different aspects of what we all universally face in the ALS M&D community. Thank you.
Thank you.